but before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes for how tonight's going to go. First, of course, I want to thank St. Anne's for allowing us to use their beautiful for this night. If you need a restroom at any point, doors on my right, in the far corner of the room over there. And for all of you out in the audience, we would love for you to keep your masks on and covering both your nose and mouth throughout the duration of this event. At the end, we'll be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A, so please start thinking of questions to ask now. And for those of you tuning in virtually on our live stream, you can buy copies of Lost and Found in the link in the description. And for those of you with us here tonight, we do have some additional copies available for purchase where you checked in. So, with all that out of the way, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Kathryn, Schulz, and Ira Glass, who join us tonight to celebrate Lost and Found finally in person. In Lost and Found, Kathryn writes about two monumental shifts in her life, the death of her father and the birth of a relationship with a woman who would become her wife. Divided into 3 parts, this memoir weaves together joy, sorrow, grief and gratitude, a meteor crash, and a wedding millions of years later. I shed a few tears reading this, and I'm sure many of you out there in the audience did as well, so we can't wait to hear what more Kathryn has to say about this incredible piece of work. Kathryn Schulz is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of Being Wrong. She won a National Magazine Award and a Pulitzer Prize for the really big one, her article about seismic risk in the Pacific Northwest. Lost and Found grew out of a losing streak, a New Yorker story that was anthologized in the Best American Essays. Her work has also appeared in the Best American Science and Nature Writing, the Best American Travel Writing, and the Best American Food Writing. A native of Ohio, she lives with her family on the eastern shore of Maryland. And as I mentioned earlier, Ira Glass joins Kathryn in conversation tonight. Ira is the host and creator of the public radio program This American Life. The show is heard each week by over 2 million listeners on more than 500 public radio stations, with another 2.3 million downloading each podcast. The show has won all sorts of awards, including the very first Pulitzer Prize ever given to a radio show or podcast. All right, so without any further delay, please help me give a very warm welcome to Kathryn and Ira.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. I'm recording this and I'm getting a level. Could you say something, Kathryn, so I can get a level on your voice as well?
Yes, I'll say thank you for coming and welcome, and huge thanks to Books Are Magic for doing this.
Okay. All right, I'm going to put that down. How many people, I thought it would be helpful just like to know how much to say in explaining the book, to know like how many people have actually read the book. Oh, most of you. How many have not read the book? Okay, all right, potential customers. So really, you're going to have to say.
All of you who just raised your hand, go out back, buy the book, and come back and talk to us.
Don't listen to instructions. Our job is to inspire, not implore. Okay, so I'll just say, like, I loved this book, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation. And my sister, my older sister, was grieving for her 2 best friends, actually. Or 2 of her 3 best friends, and started reading the book, and in the middle of the first section, Colleen said that she felt like it was more helpful than anything, and that, she said like every sentence is talking to me in this way, and then I ran into a writer whose mom, who just died, who also liked it, but described it as the happiest book on grief ever, which I think it might be. The thing that I want to start by talking about is, okay, I understand how to make a story for the radio, but I don't understand how to make this book. And just to say, to make a story for the radio, from the moment I think something could be a story, I start to structure the story in my head. Like, I think, like, okay, like here's how the plot is going to kick in, and here's what the ideas might be, and here's where they might fall. And then I go out and get the tape, which shapes then the structure a little bit. And then the tape gathering, I'm constantly thinking of like radio is peculiarly organized around the quotes. And so everything is organized around the tape. So anything you want to be an important moment in the story, you want to get a moment of tape to correspond to it. And so a lot of it is actually this weirdly, not technical, but just a very sort of dramaturgical thing of figuring out what do you want to have happen in the tape, and then you evaluate, did I get it in the tape? And then you remake the structure, and then write, and then do a series of edits to polish it. But something like this book, when I read it, it just seems like and I know this can't be true, but it seems like you just started writing about what happened to you, and then it moved forward, and periodically you're going out and you're standing back from the experience and talking about other writing you've read and other things and what words mean and things like that. And so, like, I know this is a really general question, but how do you go about the task of like, okay, I think I'm going to write a book about that. Like, how do you conceive, like, what do you know when you're going into it, and how do you organize it? Like, how do you even, like, what is the act of doing it?
Well, first of all, thank you for saying that it read like I just kind of sat down and wrote down what had happened, because I think that's the magic trick we all want to pull off, right? Is the illusion that it just somehow flowed forth naturally from the events and from the experience. That is a grand illusion, and in my case, at least a very hard-won one, if it ever works at all. How do you put a book together? Slowly.
Like, did you know, for example, do you go in knowing, like, okay, I'm going to tell the story of the hospital. I know there's going to be a biography section where I have to explain what my dad is like. There's going to be a section where, like, what do you know you're going to do?
Sure. So I actually knew a lot going into this book, is the honest answer. The great gift of this book was that I knew before I ever wrote a single sentence of it how the structure worked. Which I say is a great gift because, for me at least, and I'm sure this is somewhat variable, but writers in the audience will nod their heads, structure is probably the hardest thing about any writing project, right? And obviously structure exists at every level. A sentence has a structure, a paragraph has a structure, but the longer the project gets, the more challenging the structure is to sort out. And this book arrived to me with its structure intact. This book exists because honestly, because of the title, because of this very everyday phrase, lost and found, it populated itself for me in a crucial moment when I was thinking about writing and about this original piece I'd written about the death of my father, and I knew...
This is a story that you wrote for the New Yorker about the death of your father, and at the time you wrote it, you didn't know you were going to be writing a book.
Not at all, right.
Okay.
That was not an excerpt of the book. That was a standalone essay that then prompted me.
And what made you think it was going to be a book? What took you from this thing, which is a completely finished and very beautiful thing, to this other thing?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of years and kind of some contemplation. After I wrote that essay, which is a kind of, just for those of you who have read the book, the original essay is kind of an elegy for my father, but that elegy is embedded in this exploration of this very strange category of loss, right? Like, why is it that I would put my father in the same category as my missing cell phone, or like, the left sock that never emerged from the dryer cycle or whatever. I got interested in that question, and I wrote about that for this essay. And what turned that into a book was, first of all, the realization that there was a mirror image story to tell, which was an exploration of the category of discovery that had at the heart of it a love story, right? The story of finding my partner. But that was enticing to me. I thought it seemed really fun to write a love story. In fact, it was. But what actually clinched it, I was talking about it with my partner, about whether I would ever want to write a book, and if it was these two things, the lost part and the section on discovery, would that do the trick? And she said this totally everyday phrase, lost and found, and I actually really heard the and. It kind of amplified for me, I think, because I did find my partner and lose my father in relatively quick succession. And so I'd been thinking about emotional conjunction, right? About the reality of adult life, which is we are almost never just dealing with one thing at once. You are falling in love and grieving your father, or you adore your child, but he's driving you absolutely up the wall. Like, we just live with this kind of complication all the time, and it felt to me like, this is the kind of thing that's often very attractive to me as a writer. It felt to me like an absolutely fundamental component of like the human experience, and one that I had never really thought about much before. And so I was immediately drawn to that as the kind of binding section of the book.
Wait, so at the
four-
beginning you knew you'd have a lost part about your dad, a found part about your wife, and then you knew you'd have a part about the and, which is the section, for those who haven't read the book, where you make the case that basically losing somebody and finding somebody, the things that we discover in life, like the two are interlinked, and it's super pretty. Yeah, I was wondering if you started writing and you came to that thought, you're like, okay, good.
It was-
All right. So you knew you had that, you knew you had this structure, and it's kind of a clever structure, and that's very appealing. And it's also a structure like a fable, which is also very appealing. I think like anybody who's writing narrative, like they want it to get purer and purer, so it's closer to fable. At least I think about that. So then when you sit down to write, do you know like, okay, like I'm gonna do some biography stuff, I'm gonna do some you knew roughly like I got this section, I got this section, I got this section, I got this section, and then you sit down and you write them, the ones that are written for the New Yorker already?
I knew some of that, you know. So I had the macro structure, the like 3 parts, and within that, I knew some of the pieces of my father's life that I wanted to tell my dad. It's interesting. My father proved. This is going to sound like a very utilitarian use of a very beloved and dead father, but he would appreciate it. My father was very useful to this exploration of the category of loss because in addition to being kind of the emotional heart of that section, because of course I did love him dearly and grieved him very much, he actually exemplified kind of both extremes of that weird category. Because on the one hand, he was a Jewish refugee who came to this country at around 13, and by which point he had lost basically his entire maternal lineage in Auschwitz. He had been kicked around the planet by the kind of combined forces of geopolitical violence and poverty. So he really, his life story spoke to this kind of world historic scale of loss, right? The kind of, which if you're going to write about loss, you have to confront things like genocide. You have to confront things like pandemic, these kinds of losses that really just affect all of us. But he also, by coincidence, really exemplified the very trivial end of the category of loss because my father was unbelievably brilliant, you know, spoke 6 languages, had an almost perfect memory, was incredibly astute about the world, but not remotely astute about the whereabouts of his car keys, or for that matter, his car, right? So I knew that my dad's life story was going to do a lot of work for me in the lost section. And, you know, I had a pretty clear sense of the moments in the kind of unfolding love story from the moment I met my partner onward to our marriage of what I would want to have in there. But I don't really want to overstate any of that because I'm a terrible overwriter. You know, like this book, there's probably like 25% more of this book that is like sitting on the cutting room floor that I had to just write it to realize great story doesn't belong in the book, you know, or mediocre story doesn't belong in the book. So the macro structure was always intact, but in a sense, I should say the other thing that was always intact was a sense that there was going to be this constant conversation between the personal parts of the book, right, between me writing about my father or writing about my partner, and this kind of broader exploration of the more universal experience of losing things and the universal experience of finding things.
Right, which I would see would be the attractive of taking on the thing at all, because you can tell a personal story which has weight and then like just reach for like, what does this mean? Like, what does this say about everybody? One of the things that I saw, you told an interviewer that you wrote, the word they used was horrifying. A horrifying number of beginnings to the book before you came to the beginning that you chose. And in prepping for this, when we were emailing, I asked you, could you find some of those beginnings? And then you emailed me a bunch of those beginnings. Do you just want to pull those out? Because there are so many of them. It is horrifying.
It's really, really horrifying. I think my agent is in the audience, and if you just want to like close your ears for a little while.
Yeah, so it's on your phone, it's on my phone too. So I think we should just very quickly run through. So like for those of you who haven't read the book begins with the sentence, I dislike euphemisms for dying. And then the opening anecdote, if you want to think about like the little first beat of it, dramatically, is that the opening anecdote is realizing actually that saying the phrase, I lost my father, comes to feel exactly right, even though it's euphemistic. And so it's the arc of like, I started believing this thing, and then eventually you discover kind of without even willing it, that, oh, no, actually, this euphemism feels perfect, and then you reflect on why. So that's the opening kind of like first few pages of the book and the opening beat of the book. But there are so many, can I say, it's something for me to like figure out something when I'm writing, I often have to write it 3 or 4 different times. And so this was like, okay, so you have one here, one opening sentence. Some people, I am told, have dying words. My father had a dying silence. What was that gonna get us into?
Trouble. Yeah, so that's an example of me feeling like, well, I really went back and forth about whether to start with my father alive, or my father dead, or dying, or just not with my father at all. So that was an example of the phase where I thought, let's just like plunge in on my father's death, which ultimately is where I land. You know, I go in, you learn within, I think, a paragraph of the start of this book that my father is dead. There you would have learned within a sentence, and there is ultimately this shifted to later in the lost section. My father, you just heard me say he spoke 7 languages, and was unbelievably fluent, right? I mean, I think Ira Glass and I both are like reasonably good managers of the English language, but my dad would absolutely put us to shame. And also he loved to talk, right? He was an incredibly communicative, enthusiastic sharer of ideas and conversation. And then sometime before he died, when he was in the hospital sick, he just stopped speaking. And it was really shocking. And I think a kind of harbinger of what was going to come, which was this absolute lack of access to it, which is, of course, what happens when someone dies. So in that sense, it felt like possibly a way into that emotion, to this lack of access.
And then did you not do that because you're just like, that's too heavy to start with?
I can't even reconstruct why it didn't work, but I can tell you that I got like 3 or 4 paragraphs on from that and was like, this is a dead end. This is not going anywhere.
All right, I'm going to read some more of these, and let's run through them quickly. When I was 9 years old, I lost a red spiral-bound notebook that I've been thinking about on and off ever since.
This is by far the most humiliating opening that I've told.
And this is just saying, like, loss is a big deal, right?
Be careful what you email Ira Glass, is the moral
Okay,
of the
let's
story.
keep going. Let's keep going. This one I find completely fascinating. In the implicitly theological architecture of Grand Central Terminal, its starry ceiling of azure and gold up above, its underground tunnels with their steam and darkness down below, the lost and found is on the mortal level, down a set of stairs, past the food court, tucked in between track 100 and the MTA police. So this is really actually going to a lost and found for your book, Lost and Found.
Well, this is when I thought I might just begin with like the truly mundane losses and kind of scale it up from there, but that was not a good idea.
My father, a brilliant man in general, had a particular genius for losing things, which you get to later, but you thought like, okay.
That was a contender for a very long time, actually.
It took off past midnight, tilting upward from the land, the dense lights of the city filling its northern windows. I have to say, each of these sentences is so much better than any sentence I've ever written in my life. So, okay, it took off past midnight, tilting upward from the land, the dense lights of the city filling its northern windows, and then falling away as it continued out over the countryside. This would be so good with music underneath. The dense light of the city filling its northern windows, and then falling away as it continued out over the countryside and onward into darkness.
Okay, this was the opening that I got trapped in for the longest. If you were wondering what it was I was just describing, it was the opening minutes of the flight of Malaysia Airlines 370, which, as I'm sure many of you recall, took off from Kuala Lumpur and was never seen again. And in fact, before its remains were finally and still somewhat tentatively located somewhere in the Indian Ocean, something like 15 or 18 months elapsed. It for all intents and purposes, just vanished. Which was incredibly tragic and also kind of existentially troubling because it's very hard, I think, to understand how something as large and also, frankly, as closely tracked as a commercial airplane could just disappear.
Which I think would be attractive because basically the rest of the book is trying to figure out, kind of come to grips with, well, what is it, like, how do you get your mind around one person disappearing? So starting with like a huge plane and it's just a physical embodiment that's sort of grander that then you can scale back from in a way.
It was incredibly attractive. It's why I got trapped in it for so long. It seemed gripping, it seemed important. To your point, it seemed like it established some stakes.
It's
Yeah.
super visual too, like a whole airplane. It's not like losing.
I'm going to go back and rewrite the book with this opening. Here's why it ultimately didn't work, or anyway why I didn't reject it, or why I did reject it. And to be honest, I actually think it's possible it was the wrong call, but you know, it was a little bit of a scale problem. You're right that it establishes the grand mystery of how a thing could disappear at a grander scale than a single human. But it was a little stranded scale-wise because it's tricky to kind of draw back from there, from this truly tragic loss of life, you know, and many, many lives, and in a horrifying and unnecessary way to like, here's my dad who died peacefully at 74 in a hospital surrounded by his loved ones, which is, my mother's death was not a tragedy, and I'm quite careful to say that in the book, but it somehow seemed like, you know, here's my dad, who's one beloved person dying peacefully in relative old age. Here's the Holocaust, which because of my dad's life had to make an appearance in this book, and because I don't think you can talk about the category of loss and not talk about the sweeping losses.
Yeah.
And then here's this airplane as kind of this third weird triangle of this, which becomes a
No,
huge piece
it's
of
a
this
weird
opening.
example. Like, I think you're right not to use it at the beginning. Honestly, when you
I
get to
wrote
it,
7,000 words of that opening, by the way.
do you remember why the one you chose about disliking euphemisms for dying is the one you chose? Do you remember what you liked about it?
Opening of last resort. That's not quite true, and it's not fair, and I stand by that opening. But it's interesting, you know, I have written things where I landed finally on an opening that was self-evidently right to me. In this case, it simply solved a lot of problems. Everything else was causing problems, and this was the door that I opened that actually let me get where I was going. And ultimately, it actually did seem more useful not just to come in on loss or on grief, but to come in on this idea of loss and how we use it and how strange those ways are that we use it, because that is actually the kind of deep thing underlying the section.
Yeah.
So it just
Yeah.
it was the
and
right
it's
scale. It
premise
was
of
the scale
book.
of thought.
Yeah,
you know?
and it's the premise of the book is that these two things are together, like this idea of losing a person and losing your keys.
Right.
Okay, all right. So to summarize, so you have like a kind of sketch of like I can write about this and this and this and this, and then, but then you just have to write it, and then there's a lot of moving around and making things shorter. Okay. Let's move on to the next chapter of this interview. Okay. So one of the things that is so moving in the first part of the book is just reading your account of the effect of your father's death on you, and I feel like you sort of map out kind of a taxonomy of all the different parts of that. And so I have a part. This is the part where I think we should read a little bit from page 61 in the book, because you point this thing out. I was like, when you say it, I was like, oh, that's so nice to see somebody say. So go to 61. Okay.
I want to preface this by saying that the lighting in the church is a real challenge to my reading abilities. We'll see how this goes. It's not very long, don't worry. Like anything that goes on for too long, grief is, I don't know why people don't talk about this aspect of it more often, unbelievably boring. I don't mean in its earliest days, when the sorrow is too acute and the overall rearrangement of life too recent to allow for anything like tedium. Eventually, though, as you grow accustomed to its constant companionship, the monotony sets in. I can't recall exactly how long after my father's death this happened for me, because mourning also played havoc with my sense of time. But I think several months must have passed when the grief that had sloshed around turbulently inside me ebbed into a stagnant pool. It made life seem extremely dull, and it made me seem extremely dull, and above all, it became itself unbelievably wearying. I remember declaring out loud one day how sick I was of it, of the blanched, lethargic, dismal endlessness of grieving. It seemed an affront to my father, who was among the least boring people ever to live, as well as a waste of time, which, as his death had just reminded me in the strongest possible terms, is a precious and finite gift. But I could no more will away the dreariness, than I could will back him. To make matters worse, this boredom offered no protection from the capriciousness of grief. We think of boring as synonymous with predictable, but I found the process of grieving to be simultaneously volatile and tedious.
That's so nice. Can I talk about the opening sentence of that, where you say, and again, I hope this isn't too like a writer talking to another writer, but we'll move on from this writerly phase of this interview, I promise. Okay, so the opening line you say, like anything that goes on for too long, grief is, and then there's a parentheses. I don't know why people don't talk about this aspect of it more often. Unbelievably boring. Close parentheses, unbelievably boring. Okay, so on radio, can I say, in my medium, we never have parentheses? Because you can't have parentheses in spoken speech. And so basically radio, you're writing to sound exactly like you talk. And can I say, like, if I wrote this sentence with the parentheses, not just because of radio, but because I'm just used to thinking about sentences that way, I would absolutely take the part in the parentheses. I don't know why people don't talk about this aspect of it more often. I would make that the second sentence. It would go, like anything that goes on for too long, grief is unbelievably boring. I don't know why people don't talk about this aspect of it more often. And that way you get the punchiness of grief is unbelievably boring. Can you just talk about the pros and cons of putting the parentheses on there so then you hold off unbelievably boring for the end, please?
This is amazing. I hope you guys aren't doing anything until like midnight because I'm not leaving the stage. Yeah, gosh, I would love to talk about that. So one of the best pieces of writing advice I ever got, kind of on the level of craft, it's about sentences, and it's put the punchline at the end. So to be clear, a punchline isn't always funny, but it's like the oomph of the sentence, right? The part that's going to kind of like stop you or get you in the gut or make you have a reaction of any kind.
It's the new big explosion. It's the big idea.
Yeah. Exactly. Or right, the surprising part, or whatever it may be. So obviously, unbelievably boring is the punchline of the sentence. We think of grief as a lot of things, but I don't think we customarily think of it as boring. It's very boring. The corollary in my mind, I'm, by the way, constructing a post hoc defense for a sentence that just came about because I think my mind really loves wandering down every possible cul-de-sac in a sentence, but here's the post hoc defense. The corollary of putting the punchline at the end of a sentence, as I think any comedian would know, is the longer you can delay the arrival of that punchline, the more punch it has.
Oh.
So, to my mind, I think something about squeezing in the, I don't know why people don't talk about this more often. I understand it's actually potentially confusing. I understand we don't, I love my editors at The New Yorker. I think I could have made the case for this, but their instinct definitely would have been to kill this and rearrange it as you suggest, because they hate a referent when they don't know what it's referring to, right? And in this case, we have no idea what I'm talking about when I say, I don't know why people don't talk about this aspect of grief more often. We haven't gotten to the aspect. And yet, to my mind, the payoff when you get there.
I understand. You're delaying, it makes so much sense. Yeah, so you're delaying unbelievably boring to the end, so you get one punch out of it, and you're lengthening the part before it. Okay. So then, from that point, in the book, it's part of the kind of like taking apart what's it like to be grieving and what are all the things you feel and go through, or at least that you went through. You write at one point that one of the things that surprised you is that you thought that sadness would actually play more of a role and that you would be sad, but you say like kind of the sadness goes away and gets swept away by all these other feelings. There's a part where you say, like, it felt like grief was moving through me, like it was a force outside my influence, entirely wild, no more swayed by my will than a mountain lion or a storm. Like all truly wild things, it was overwhelming, and sometimes frightening up close, but strangely compelling from a little distance, stark and awesome in the old sense of the word. And you just talk about, and you lay out kind of like all the other feelings of anger and just everything else that would take the place of sadness, and then sadness would kind of sometimes peak up at a completely surprising moment when you weren't expecting it. There's one moment where you overhear somebody at a cafe or something say, I should call my dad more often, something like that.
I wish my daughter called me more often.
That's it, right? It's from the father's point of view. And just like the way that you talk about grief overtaking you, this is the part of the book where the thoughts started to come to me as just the reader who I am. And obviously this isn't going to be everybody's experience, but I just thought like, oh my God, I think maybe I'm kind of a robot. Like I have never experienced like that kind of grief. And my father's still alive. My mother passed 16 years ago, and like I was sad when my mother died, but because of the way our relationship was and who she was, like I did not grieve like this at all for her. Like, and other people I've known who I've loved have died, and I've never grieved in this way where I was taken over by it in this way, and I really started to feel like, oh, I'm like a smaller person. Like, I don't know how else to say it. Like.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah.
I feel certain you're not a smaller person in any possible respect. I think, and I dwell on this some in the book. I think grief is shockingly, or not even grief. I think one's response to the death of a loved one is shockingly variable. And I think it varies not only by the obvious, who was that person unto you, but by, what else was going on in your life? How specifically did they die? What vanished for you when that person vanished? I guess I just think, I don't think any version of mourning someone is strange is one thing I would say about that, or makes you or anyone smaller. And
No,
I think
I think all of that's true, but I think the level at which you grieved your dad had to do with the closeness you felt with him and with what, just that. And I think that, this is a weird thing to be confessing to a group of people in a church. But for everything that I loved about my mom, and for everything that I know that I became because of her, and for all the moments I can think of when we were really close, and for everything I owe her, and for everything I see in her that I still love, and that I see of her and myself, I just didn't feel that, and I think that it's your relationship with your dad that's the most important of those things, and I don't even know. I don't know. I just thought like, oh, you really had a different childhood than I did because of that, and maybe a different childhood than lots of people. Like honestly, if people feel comfortable saying this, I would be very curious if people are on her team or my team. So feel free to sit this question out because it's so personal. But if people have grieved someone at the level that Kathryn has, I'd be curious to see if it's. I would assume it's most of the audience, right? And again, feel free to. It's not most of the audience. It is. Yeah, it's a lot. And people who have not, people on my team. Yeah.
kind of an even mix, actually.
Yeah.
Look, Ira, you said this. You quoted your sister, I think, saying this beautiful thing, or maybe it was it might have been your writer friend, saying it's the happiest book about grief she's ever read, and I'm so happy to hear that. What a wonderful reaction to it. And the truth is, I'm sure I think of this as a book primarily about happiness, actually, despite the grief in it, and I think of it as a book about love. And the fact is, the two main characters in it, my father and my partner, I do think are two of the most remarkable people I've ever met, and because I'm not obliged to be objective about the people I love, or in fact even capable of it, I think they're two of the most remarkable people kind of in existence, So naturally, what do you get from that? You get a love story that is pretty all-in love story, and you get a grief story that was very acute, and it's true, my dad was amazing, and this is true unto all of us, so it's so weird and so banal to say, but just absolutely unrecreatable or replaceable, and that did feel devastating to me. Not forever and ever, right? I miss my dad greatly. I wish it would make my dad very angry that the whole reason this conversation is happening is because he died, because he would deeply love to be here and he would be having a ball. But sure, I suppose
I know, but and as you say in the "and" part of the book, the level of grief is completely interlinked with the level of love.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I like, I'm not sure I've ever loved anybody in that way that much.
Well, I mean, look, I do feel
Are you aware of
profoundly
that
lucky.
though? Like when you look around the world and look around your acquaintances, do you ever think about that? That like you're in a particular, that like you're a particular person with a particular scale of like heartedness, you know, versus some of the rest of us who just don't have that. Like, because I feel aware of it from my side of the, like from the meager, shallow side that I sit on. But is that something that you ever think about on your side? Do you do you deal with some editor and you're just like, well, obviously they're one of the smaller people, you know?
I think that 6 or 7 times a day. No, I've never thought that once in my life. But I do think, I mean, I certainly think of myself as being uncommonly fortunate. And I'm fortunate in all the ways we conventionally talk about privilege, but I do think the deepest and most life-altering way, just in some respect, that I'm fortunate is I do in fact come from an incredibly happy family, which I think set me up to go make an incredibly happy family. And do I think that I have a kind of spectacular romance? Absolutely. Do I think that my parents were remarkable people and I grew up in a wonderful family? Absolutely. I mean, you talked about the kind of fable scale of things, and I don't want to invoke that in the sense of like, you know, falsehood, like fabulized, but I certainly think that my families have a fable-like quality to them, and just a kind of gift of love at the core.
I wonder who's more typical. Like if more families are happy. Like I feel like especially in New York, I feel like the idea of like a happy family really gets undersold. And it's a real question. Like because I think, you know what I mean? Like, and I think there are different degrees of happiness and people get along in different degrees. Like I wonder what's more common.
It's an interesting question, and I will say I was certainly very mindful writing this book that there were going to be readers who would chafe at the love story. Because I know, not an idiot, and I have a lot of friends of various emotional orientations, and you know, I knew that some people would either out of cynicism or out of envy or whatever it may be, just have a difficult time with a pretty purely happy love story. Now, for my purposes, exactly.
Wait, why? What's your reading on that? Why? Why would people have a problem with like hearing a love story? Love stories are super popular.
Love stories are popular. It's true. It's true. And actually, I think I overstated my fear. I should say this was the fear was legitimate. It's been a quite minority reaction to the book, but as I was writing it, I did have that concern. You know, I lived in New York for a while, and it's true. It's, you know, happy families I think might be undersold here, as you say, and including happy relationships and marriages.
You just feel like people would just feel like it's corny?
Yeah, or cloying or something. Or worse still, I mean, I think the cynical response is, oh, that can't be real, or, oh, you know, just wait another 5 years, wait another 10 years, wait till you have children. But people, there's a tragic, I think, instinct to be skeptical of happiness and skeptical of love. And some of that is, of course, for reasons I understand. Many people, I was given the great gift of feeling loved and feeling able to love, and I understand that not everyone is, and that even the idea of finding love, let alone sort of working out the pragmatics of it, which of course are difficult and involve tension and friction and fights and all this kind of stuff, all of which I get into in the book, but I'm sympathetic to why people would resist the possibility, and yet it's my life, you know?
Yeah. There's just with this in mind of just like how you're portraying your dad and your wife. A journalist friend of mine is in a book group on the Upper West Side of New York, and there's 2 or 3 other journalists in it, and his wife is a journalist also, and but most of the people in the group, he explained to me, are therapists, and of various sorts, and various Upper West Side sorts of therapists, and Upper East Side therapists apparently, and they discussed your book last week. And my friend...
Oh my God, I wish I could have just been hiding in the background listening.
Well, he loved your book, and most people in the group liked it, but did not love it because they had one particular issue with the book. And if you're curious, I'll tell you.
I'm obviously extremely curious.
Their main problem with the book was they just didn't buy it. They didn't buy that your dad is as perfect. They're like, no dad is as perfect as this dad. Like, they just thought, like, well, you must be prettifying what your dad was like, and you must be protecting him, and your wife also leaving out all the blemishes or the difficulties, like all the things that make a relationship complicated with one's father, even like one's father who seems very wonderful in many ways, that you sort of held your hand over any of those complications. In fact, my friend's wife told me that her dad was remarkably like your dad, including like landing in the United States in Cleveland. English was his ninth language. He loved wordplay. He dominated any room he walked into. And she said there was definitely a downside to that she and her siblings felt. And she's just like, where was that?
Well, so first of all, thank you for, proving my point and my fears. Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a couple of things to say about that. The chief one is, that silences me wrestling with which of these is like the higher order statement to make. I'm going to make a statement about the kind of book I wrote and then a statement about happiness and families. The statement about the kind of book, we began this by talking about kind of how this book works at the structural level and what it's on about, what I'm trying to do. And I guess the most basic thing to say is, yes, this book is a memoir, says so right on the cover. Thank you, Random House, which felt strongly and correctly that it should be there. On the other hand, as memoirs go, it's somewhat weird. You learn a lot more about my father and my partner, and for that matter, my partner's family, than you do about me. I mean, you're with me, right, as a sensibility through these pages. But it's not like a completist account of my life in any way, shape, or form. And it didn't set out to be, right, because what it actually wants to be, it's a memoir, but covertly or overtly, what it really wants to be doing is using these moments from my life to think about these experiences of loss and discovery and emotional conjunction, or whatever you want to call the kind of andness at the end of this book. So there was no universe in which I was going to write a book that was like, that every kind of slight seismographic register of my inner life with respect to my father, my partner, and trips to the grocery store. Like, it's just not that interesting to me, and also not what I set out to do in this. Which is by way of saying there's a great many things that aren't in this book because they didn't belong in the book, because the structure of the book and the contents of the book were dictated by the text. Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. But it's so interesting. I mean, so that's exactly what I mean, the kind of resistance to the notion that such a thing as happiness exists. And what I'm not trying to do is say, I've never fought with my partner or been frustrated with my partner. I was never, upset with my father or he with me. And certainly I get into that, especially with my partner. I mean, there's a lengthy fight that I kind of parse in great detail in the middle of the found section of this book, because I do think it's important, right? I think it's a very interesting question. You find someone that's beautiful, you fall in love with them, that's beautiful, but then you find out all of these things about them, and some of those discoveries are like, whoa, we see the world really differently, or we communicate really differently in the face of X, Y, or Z. And those are discoveries too, and you have to contend with them, and you're not going to put together an enduring and happy relationship until you learn how to do so. So all that felt important and material to the project, but I don't know, it's so clear to me that, like, actually the balance sheet on these relationships is so deeply on the side of love and gratitude. And I don't think there's, it's interesting, the kind of therapeutic reaction of, like, obviously she's withholding, or obviously she's protecting.
Well, especially with your dad, they're like, well, no relationship is that good with a person's dad. And then, and also there was a feeling of like, it must have complicated the experience of grief, which is the subject of the book.
Wait, what must have complicated it?
Just like whatever conflict you would have had with your dad. I mean, this is a bunch of therapists. You know what I mean? Like, would complicate your experience of grief,
Yeah, well, look, I mean, it's interesting. Plato wanted a society run by philosophers because he was a philosopher, and that's to say that, of course, therapists encountering a book are going to read it through a therapeutic lens, and also inevitably the people therapists spend most of the time talking to, thinking about, dealing with, are people who are struggling with
No,
parts of
point taken.
relationships that are.
But were there things that, like in your experience of grief, that you decided, I'm going to leave these out of the book because either they were too personal, which is totally, you're right, and you should, or just like, you just feel like, that's not the story I'm telling.
I love this soaring chorus behind us now. It's really
That
great.
was really good music too.
I know, wow. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff I left out, and I'm trying to think if any of that was out of. I'm sincerely. It's an interesting question. I'm like sincerely trying to think. Was any of that about protecting my dad or my family? I mean, everything that comes to mind was like a. This is gonna sound like. I mean, now I'm gonna sound like the robot. Everything that comes to mind is like a craft issue or a technical issue. Like it sort of didn't
That doesn't
belong.
seem trivial to me.
belong.
That seems real. Like,
Yeah.
I understand. It didn't fit into the thing you were making.
Yeah, like I'm not. I mean, I suppose it's an interesting question. If I had been like withholding some great secret, would I reveal it unto you, the crowd at St. Anne's tonight? Maybe, but I don't have any sense of withholding some great secret.
That seems fun.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Okay. I have other questions here and other things to praise the book with. But I feel like, given the time, let's turn to your questions. We're about 15 minutes from the end. What we'll do is raise your hand, and I'll repeat what you're saying so everybody can hear. Questions? Yes. Correct me if I got this wrong. You're saying when you start a project like this, what motivates you? Is it for yourself, your family? Is there like a public service kind of aspect to it?
Thank you. It's a great question. So I'm normally a little bit of a selfish writer. I write because I have an itch to scratch. Like there's something that's interesting to me, or something I want to think about, or sometimes just something that seems fun to write about. And certainly in this case, I think the initial motivation was very much in keeping with that. I know I can remember very clearly. It seemed really fun to me to get to write a love story. Love stories are really fun, right? And in fact, that was a real delight of this book. And had a little bit of a sense of like, as did writing about my father, it had a little bit of a sense of, this is going to sound grandiose, and I swear I don't have these feelings about myself or my career. This is very specific to my family. It felt like something I could like leave for posterity, right? For my kids, for my grandkids, like a sense of, I have my grandmother's and my great-grandmother's diaries, and they're incredibly meaningful to me, and I thought it seemed beautiful to try to take some of this overwhelming love that motivated both the story of my father's loss and the story of meeting my partner, and preserve them in some sense, which of course is a kind of, inevitably failed bulwark against loss itself, but that's a conversation for another time. But I do think as it moved on, I thought partly because, right, the pandemic caught up to the book, and so everyone was thinking about loss and dealing with loss, and frankly thinking about conjunction, right? Like all of our lives were suddenly like, I'm so happy to have so much time with my kids, but also I have no childcare and no schooling, and I'm going insane. Like there was a lot of the stuff I'd been wrestling with and thinking about the book sort of weirdly kind of came to the forefront of the public conversation while I was writing it. And so I do think I ultimately had a little bit of a sense of, I hope that this book, for however few people, is either a balm or a joy. I hope this is a book that someone is given when they're grieving someone, or that someone is given when they get engaged or get married, and it feels to them like, oh, right, like this is linked to this deep and momentous experience of my own life of losing someone or of finding someone. So there was which again sounds more kind of lofty and ambitious than I mean to in a certain sense, but I'm not oblivious to readers. I don't think you can or should be as a writer, and I would like to think, and have been really happy, to be honest, to hear, from readers now that it's been out in the world for a little while, that it has met people in their moments. I've had the great joy of hearing a lot of people tell me about, how they've been married for 49 years and they're still dancing in the kitchen, to the point of, yes, other people are on, Team Kathryn over here, or to say, I just lost someone and thank you, like your sister, thank you for words for this.
Questions? Another question? Yes, and speak up as loud as you can. I think because where you're sitting, most people could hear you, and that was too long to repeat. So
I can fill that or try. Yeah, so for those of you who haven't read it, part of the found section kind of grapples with this question of should we go out actively searching for things, or are they just going to fall in our lap? Or rather, it divides finding into two different experiences, and one of them is searching, right? And then you find it, and one of them is serendipity. It just, falls in your lap, and that's wonderful and delightful. Where do I fall? I fall on both of them. There are certain kinds of searching that I think have to be active. Any intellectual quest is an active quest, as are many. Look, I'm very glad that a lot of people just spend a really lot of time and money to find a vaccine for a global pandemic. There are many things in life that you just have to fully dedicate yourself to if you want to ultimately find them. In matters of love, my partner feels to me like she kind of materialized in my life basically out of nowhere, on a beautiful spring day in the little town that I was living, and that no amount of seeking her out would have brought that into being. But who knows, And I certainly am not prescriptive about that, meaning I know plenty of people who have found love by actively searching for it. I will only say that of all the things we look for, finding love presents really specific and difficult search problems, chiefly because, as a rule, we have no idea what we were looking for. So I'm personally very glad that I found my love serendipitously.
Next question. I think actually I'm going to pull over a microphone just because I think it's going to be easier with the few remaining questions for people to hear. So let's have your question, and while we're doing this, I'm going to set up a mic for other questions, so people should form a mind. Yeah.
Stand up and speak as loudly as you can. So you're pointing out all the references to classical
literature and other things and poetry in the book, and you're saying like, are you an autodidact, or were you lucky enough to have teachers? Let me just pause. If you want to ask the next few questions, just stand up at the mic, so that way everybody will be able to hear you more clearly.
First of all, thank you for the lovely question, and for noticing that about the book. I do secretly think of the book as kind of a covert poetry anthology. There's quite a lot of poetry in it, which I was very happy to share with readers. I'm absolutely not an autodidact. I have benefited from incredible teachers all my life, starting, of course, with my parents, who, as the book kind of makes plain, presented me in very inviting ways with all kinds of beautiful thinkers and beautiful stories, and actually with the kind of art of storytelling. I was lucky enough to come up through truly a fabulous, fabulous public school system, and had incredible teachers truly from elementary school on, who nurtured me, but only because they were nurturing everyone, and truly wanted us to learn to think and learn to love thinking and find things that we loved to think about. So I feel incredibly grateful for that, and then I just kind of trotted off, to the fancy university, and I think in a way that I hope is common, but I fear might not be, had a genuine intellectual experience there. Really did have wonderful mentors, had kind of an intellectual community, and people who wanted to sit around talking about ideas, and so no, I mean I love to learn, but I feel that I had sort of the easiest possible route to that, and I say that as someone who was both raised by an autodidact and frankly fell in love with one. So I'm very mindful of what a gift it is to not have to do all that work for yourself, and to be kind of armed with all the requisite tools to sort of expand your intellectual universe steadily and at every stage of development, if that makes sense.
Let's have one last question. If somebody has something, if you want to come up to the mic.
I was curious if you had any different endings for the book.
Thank you for the spirit of that question.
That's both a fabulous
I feel
last
affirmed.
question. Fabulous question in general, and fabulous last question. And yes, I'm sure it warmed the heart of Mr. Ira Glass sitting here. No, I did not. So I said early on that one of the great gifts of this book was structure. I knew the structure from the beginning. The other great gift of this book was that I knew the ending from the very beginning. And I knew that because it is actually, in terms of the last few lines of the book at least, it is actually identical to the ending of the essay I wrote in the New Yorker after my father died. And I knew the moment I sat down to think about the book, I knew that there was no way I was going to improve upon that ending, which is not to say it's like the greatest ending ever written, but it was a very hard fought and hard won ending for the New Yorker piece. 97% of it was written, and I remember, sending it into my editor with the note that was basically like, please ignore the existing ending. It doesn't work. I know it doesn't work. I have to figure it out. I'm so sorry. And he's a very patient man and very used to me, so he said, okay. And the days went by, and the days went by, and eventually I got this very tactful text. It's a bad sign when your editor resorts to texting you. I got this very tactful text. How's that ending coming? And I remember quite clearly. It was winter. It was evening. It was dark outside. I was sitting in this blue chair in our darkened living room, thinking about the problem of the ending of this piece. And I had been stuck on this idea of loss, and I was thinking through, like, losing and the yearning to hold on to things, right? What I was wrestling with at the end of the book was, we want so much to hold on to things, but that's actually not our role and not our right, and just not fundamentally, the outcome of being human, and yet that yearning to just hold tight and not lose things is so strong. And I kept thinking about that, and I was very trapped in the language of loss because I had been thinking about loss all throughout the writing of the piece, and I suddenly had this like tiny little inner shift, which was a shift away from trying desperately not to lose things to trying to keep things, like the urge to just keep everything for ourselves. And instantly there was a bridge from keeping to this idea of keeping watch. And the book ends, as the essay ends, with the sentence, "We are here to keep watch, not to keep." And I knew the moment I had the thought that it was the right ending, and the reason I had been sitting there for days and days and days ignoring my editor and pacing around and thinking, and I knew the moment that I sat down to write the book that it was the right, it was the right ending because it was the right thought. You know, it was where the whole book was tending, and there was no universe in which it was going to swerve and go someplace else, so there was no universe in which some other language would say more clearly or concisely what needed to be said there. So, no, a huge relief to me all along as I knew where I was going. A rare feeling in my life.
I was to say, like, one of the things that, because we have to write so many endings in the show, the ending to each story, the ending of, like, and some people really struggle with that, and I feel like the thing you're illustrating is this thing that I see all the time, which is like, if you do it right, like, if you think about the ending, like, the entire story should be sending you to it. And, yeah. Like,
Yeah, there's this beautiful thing John McPhee says that's about beginnings and endings, which is that you should be able to shine a flashlight down the well, the deep, deep well of your piece and have it hit the bottom. So, you know, right from the beginning, it should be, you should know exactly where you're going, and you have to kind of stay on that trail of light, or you're just going to be kind of casting your lantern into the darkness away from where you're ultimately going. I think about that flashlight all the time at both beginnings and endings.
okay. Well, thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you, Ira. What a
So you'll be
delight.
here signing books, and so bring up your book, and thank you all for coming out. Thanks.
Thank you so much.